I'm Cassandra Mitchell, 34, and I never thought I'd catch my father-in-law stealing from me. The $50,000 discrepancy in my business account made my blood run cold. I've always been meticulous with my finances. I track every penny. When Richard Wilson offered to help with my business accounting, I hesitated but gave in. The betrayal cut deeper than just money. It was family, trust, and my entire livelihood at stake. What Richard didn't realize was that I document every single transaction down to the penny, and I was about to use his own arrogance against him. Before I dive into this nightmare, where are you watching from today? If my story of betrayal and financial detective work interests you, hit that like and subscribe button. Trust me, you'll want to stick around to see how I caught my father-in-law red-handed and what happened when his perfect facade finally cracked. I built my interior design business from nothing but determination and a maxed-out credit card. 7 years ago, I was just a girl with a dream and a design degree, working out of my tiny apartment kitchen. Now, Mitchell Interiors occupies a beautiful downtown office space with 5 employees and a roster of high-end clients. Every penny, every success, every setback, I earned them all. My husband Thomas Wilson has always been supportive, if somewhat passive about the business. He works as a high school English teacher and has always been proud of my entrepreneurial spirit, but he doesn't get involved in the day-to-day operations. He's gentle, kind, the complete opposite of his father, and maybe that's why we balance each other so well. My father-in-law, Richard Wilson, is a different story entirely. A retired finance executive from a major banking corporation, Richard carries himself with the insufferable confidence of someone who's always been the smartest person in the room. From the moment Thomas introduced us, I could tell Richard saw me as beneath him, a girl playing at business who would eventually fail without a real professional guiding her. "Interior design is such a lovely hobby," he said at our first meeting, patting my hand condescendingly. "But do you have a backup plan when the economy shifts?" That was 7 years ago. And despite my business thriving through an economic downturn that actually saw wealthy clients investing more in their homes, Richard never changed his tune. At every family dinner, every holiday gathering, every birthday celebration, he'd find ways to question my business decisions. "Are you sure you should be expanding right now, Cassandra? That new hire seems risky in this market. Have you considered a more conservative investment approach?" The Wilson family dynamic doesn't help. Richard is the unquestioned patriarch, a role he's cultivated with military precision. His wife, Elizabeth, a former nurse who gave up her career when they started a family, has spent 40 years deferring to his judgment. She's a kind woman trapped in the amber of 1,950 seconds wifely submission, always echoing Richard's opinions and smoothing over any tension he creates. Thomas, their only child, grew up desperate for his father's approval. While he supports me completely in private, I've watched him shrink in his father's presence, reverting to the eager-to-please boy still seeking validation. It's the one friction point in our otherwise solid marriage, his inability to stand firmly against his father when Richard crosses a line. Last year, Mitchell Interiors hit a growth spurt. We landed 3 major commercial projects simultaneously. And suddenly, my simple bookkeeping system wasn't cutting it anymore. I needed more sophisticated financial management, but wasn't quite ready to hire a full-time CFO. That's when Richard made his move. We were at their house for Sunday dinner, a monthly obligation Thomas insisted we maintain. I mentioned my accounting challenges between bites of Elizabeth's pot roast. Richard's eyes lit up. "You know, Cassandra, this is exactly the kind of thing I specialized in before retirement. I could help you set up a proper financial system." Elizabeth nodded enthusiastically. "Richard's so good with money. He managed millions for his clients." I felt my stomach tighten. "That's kind, but I was thinking of hiring a part-time accountant." "Nonsense," Richard waved dismissively. "Why pay someone when I can do it for free? Family helps family." Thomas placed his hand on mine under the table, giving it a gentle squeeze. "It could be really helpful, Cass. Dad has decades of experience." I saw the hopeful look in my husband's eyes. This was his dream, his father and wife working together, validating his choice in a spouse by bringing her into the family business sphere. How could I say no without seeming ungrateful, suspicious, or worst of all, Incompetent, exactly what Richard already believed me to be. I have a pretty specific way of tracking everything, I said carefully. I'm particular about my system. Richard chuckled. I'm sure your system is adequate for a small operation, but if you're growing, you need professional oversight. I can modernize everything while maintaining your quirks. The condescension dripped from every word, but I swallowed my pride. Maybe he really could help. Maybe this could heal the rift between us. Maybe Thomas would finally see his father recognize my business acumen. All right, I said finally. You can help with the accounting system setup, but I maintain final approval on everything. Richard smiled, victorious. Of course, dear. You're still the boss. The way he said boss like it was a child playing pretend should have been my first warning. But I was tired, overwhelmed with growth, and hoping against hope that this might be the olive branch our family needed. I gave Richard limited access to my business accounts, set him up with view-only permissions on most systems, and administrator rights only on the new accounting software we selected together. I thought I'd been careful. I thought I'd protected myself while accepting his help. I had no idea I'd just invited a wolf to guard my henhouse. I've always been particular about tracking money, a trait that saved my business more than once. My system is simple but comprehensive. Every transaction, no matter how small, gets recorded in 3 places. First, in the official accounting software. Second, in my personal spreadsheet system with custom categories. Third, in a daily journal where I note not just the amount, but the context of each business expense or income. Some might call it obsessive. I call it thorough. When you've built something from nothing, you protect it. The first discrepancy appeared about 2 months after Richard took over. A vendor payment for $1,200 that showed up in our official records didn't match my spreadsheet. According to my meticulous notes, that particular fabric supplier charged us $980 for that order. I called the vendor directly to verify. The invoice they had on record was indeed for $980. When I approached Richard about it, he was lounging in what had become his chair in my office, feet propped on my coffee table. Richard, I found something odd in the Marshall Fabrics payment. He barely looked up from his laptop. What's that? I explained the discrepancy, showing him both records side by side on my tablet. Oh, that, he chuckled, waving dismissively. There was a surcharge for rush delivery. I categorized it separately in the sub-account, but we didn't request rush delivery for that order. The vendor called and said they needed to expedite it or it would be delayed 3 weeks. I authorized the charge rather than hold up your project. He finally looked at me, eyebrows raised. Would you have preferred to tell your client their lobby furniture would be delayed a month? It sounded reasonable, but something felt off. In the future, please check with me before authorizing additional charges. And I need all charges documented in the main ledger. Cassandra. Richard sighed with exaggerated patience. This is exactly why you needed help. Modern accounting isn't about tracking every penny in one place. It's about sophisticated categorization and subledgers. I'm trying to bring your system into this century. I still need to know where every dollar goes. This level of micromanagement is exactly why small businesses fail to scale, he said, his tone dripping with condescension. You can't grow if you're counting paperclips. That night, I mentioned the interaction to Thomas as we got ready for bed. I'm sure Dad was just trying to be efficient, Thomas said, pulling back the covers. He managed corporate accounts for decades. He probably thought he was making an executive decision. That's not how my business works. I make the executive decisions. Thomas sighed. Try to see it from his perspective. He's used to having authority. It's hard for him to take a secondary role. Then maybe he shouldn't have volunteered to help me, I said, more sharply than intended. He's just trying to bond with you, Cass. This means a lot to him, to us. I bit my tongue. Thomas couldn't see how his father's help came with strings, attached strings that were starting to feel like a noose around my business. Over the next few weeks, I found more discrepancies. A $300 difference in a contractor payment. An $850 office supply order that should have been $650. A missing $500 client déposit. Each time I questioned Richard, he had a ready explanation. Administrative fees. Service charges. accounting allocations to different quarters. He threw around financial jargon like confetti, making me feel small for questioning his expertise. "This is standard practice in real businesses," he'd say. Or, "This is why you brought me in. These nuances are beyond simple bookkeeping." When I insisted on documentation, he produced complex spreadsheets that technically balanced but were needlessly convoluted. Trying to follow his paper trail was like navigating a labyrinth. The situation came to a head at a Wilson family dinner. Elizabeth had prepared Richard's favorite pot roast, and he was in rare form, holding court about the economy. "Mitchell Interiors is positioned for remarkable growth," Richard announced, as if it were his company. Once we restructured the archaic financial system Cassandra was using, my fork froze halfway to my mouth. "Restructured? We agreed you would help organize, not overhaul my system," Richard laughed, looking at Thomas. "Your wife is so attached to her little notebook system. Adorable, but hardly sustainable for a serious business. My system has kept me profitable for 7 years," I said evenly. "And now you're ready for big leagues," Richard continued, ignoring my comment. "I've already identified several inefficiencies. Did you know she was overpaying vendors by negotiating without leverage points?" Thomas looked uncomfortable but said nothing. "Richard," I said, setting down my fork, "I didn't authorize any renegotiations with my vendors. Sometimes you need to move quickly in business," he replied. "I saved you nearly $3,000 this quarter already through better vendor management." That was news to me. I'd built relationships with my vendors based on fair pricing and mutual respect. "What exactly did you say to them?" I asked. "Just that as your financial manager. I was conducting a review of all expenditures. Most rolled over immediately when I mentioned volume discount standards. My carefully cultivated vendor relationships, damaged by his bullying tactics. I could feel my blood pressure rising. "You're not my financial manager," I said firmly. "You're helping with accounting system setup." Temporarily, the table went silent. Elizabeth looked down at her plate. Thomas shifted uncomfortably. "Cassandra," Richard said, his voice dangerously calm, "I'm dedicating significant time to fixing the mess you call a financial system. A little gratitude would be appropriate." "Richard," Thomas finally interjected. "Cass appreciates your help, but it's still her business. Stay out of this, son," Richard snapped. "You don't understand business. Neither of you do, clearly." That night, I couldn't sleep. The pattern was becoming clear, but I needed proof. I needed to know if these discrepancies were incompetence or something more sinister. The next morning, I made a decision. Without telling Thomas, I installed financial monitoring software that would track every keystroke, every transaction, every change Richard made to my account. If he was simply being controlling and condescending, I'd have ammunition to remove him from my business. If he was doing something worse, I needed to know. I also set a trap. I created a fake invoice for a new vendor, one that didn't actually exist, and left it clearly visible on my desk before a meeting with Richard. The invoice was for $2,500 for design consultation services, payable to Westwood Creative Solutions, a company I had invented with a business address that led to a P.O. box I had quietly rented. If Richard was honest, he'd ask me about this new vendor. If he wasn't, well, I'd find out soon enough. The monitoring software delivered results faster than I expected. Within 3 days, I watched in real time as Richard logged into our payment system and authorized a $2,500 payment to the fake vendor I'd created. The funds were directed to a bank account I'd never seen before, not the P.O. box address on the invoice. My hands shook as I took screenshots of everything. This wasn't just controlling behavior or financial disagreements. This was theft. Plain and simple. I needed expert help, someone I could trust completely. I called Melissa Rogers, my college roommate and now a forensic accountant for a major auditing firm. We met at a coffee shop 3 towns over, far from anywhere Richard or his friends might spot us. "This is serious, Cass," Melissa said after examining my evidence. "He's created a sophisticated embezzlement scheme. These aren't just accounting differences, they're deliberate diversions of funds. So I'm not crazy." Melissa shook her head, her expression grim. "The fake vendor test proves intent. He didn't just make a mistake, he actively stole that money. Should I confront him?" "Not yet," Melissa cautioned. "Based on what I'm seeing, This probably isn't his first rodeo. Let's dig deeper before you tip your hand. With Melissa's guidance, I began a more thorough investigation. We discovered Richard had created not just one, but 5 fake vendors, each with legitimate-sounding names that mirrored actual businesses I worked with. Marshall Textile Group instead of my actual vendor, Marshall Fabrics, Westside Lighting Designs instead of Westside Lighting. The similarity in names made the transactions less likely to trigger suspicion in a casual review. Each fake vendor had its own bank account, all leading back to a holding company registered in Richard's brother-in-law's name. "This is elaborate," Melissa whispered as we tracked the money flows. "He's been planning this since before he offered to help you." The betrayal cut deep, but it was about to get worse. As we dug into Richard's background, we discovered he'd been quietly forced into retirement from his previous position after accounting irregularities were discovered. The company had kept it quiet, allowing him to leave with his reputation intact rather than face a scandal. We also uncovered evidence of significant gambling debts at 3 different casinos within driving distance of the city. Richard Wilson, paragon of financial responsibility, had a serious gambling problem that he'd kept hidden from his family for years. I struggled with whether to tell Thomas what I'd discovered. Every night, I'd come home carrying the weight of his father's betrayal, trying to act normal while my mind raced. Thomas noticed my distraction. "Is everything okay at work?" he asked one evening as we did the dishes together. "You seem stressed." I nearly broke then, nearly told him everything. But I needed absolute certainty before destroying his image of his father. "Just busy with the Hendricks project," I lied. "The client keeps changing specifications." The next day, Melissa and I discovered the largest theft yet. Richard had diverted a $50,000 client deposit, the first payment for our biggest commercial project to date, into an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. The money was gone, untraceable, and I would have to deliver on a massive project without the deposit I'd counted on for materials and labor. I couldn't keep it from Thomas any longer. That night, I laid out the evidence: screenshots, bank records, the fake vendor test results, everything. Thomas stared at the papers spread across our dining room table, his face ashen. "There must be some explanation. Dad wouldn't do this." "He did do it, Thomas. I have timestamps, authorizations, transfers, all with his login credentials from his computer." "Maybe he was hacked," Thomas suggested desperately. "Maybe someone stole his identity. I have video from the office security camera of him at my computer making these transfers." Thomas's expression crumbled. "Why? We have money. He and Mom are comfortable. Why would he steal from you, from us?" I showed him the gambling records Melissa had uncovered. Years of losses, hundreds of thousands of dollars, all hidden from Elizabeth and the rest of the family. "No," Thomas whispered, shaking his head. "No, this can't be right." "I'm sorry," I said, reaching for his hand. "I wish it wasn't true." Thomas pulled away, standing abruptly. "I need to ask him myself. He deserves a chance to explain. If you tell him what we know, he'll destroy evidence. We need to be strategic about this." "He's my father," Thomas shouted, tears in his eyes. "Not some criminal you're building a case against." "He's stolen over $80,000 from my business," I said, my voice breaking. "Our business. The thing that pays our mortgage, that will fund our future children's college, that we've worked so hard to build. I love you, but I can't let this continue." Thomas stormed out, slamming the door behind him. I sat alone at the table, surrounded by evidence of betrayal, wondering if I'd just lost my husband along with my money. 3 hours later, Thomas returned, his eyes red from crying. "I didn't tell him," he said quietly. "I drove to their house, sat in the driveway for an hour, but I couldn't go in. I couldn't face him knowing what I know now." I held him as he broke down again. "What do you want to do?" I asked when he'd calmed. "Whatever you need to do to protect yourself, I'll support you," he said finally. "But I need to be there when you confront him. I need to hear him admit it." Together, we formed a plan. With Melissa's help, we would gather one final, undeniable piece of evidence. Then we would confront Richard with the entire family present. I just hadn't expected to discover how deep the betrayal went, or how violently Richard would react when cornered. We chose Sunday dinner for the confrontation. The Wilson family tradition that had been the stage for so many of Richard's subtle undermining comments seemed fitting for his unmasking. Thomas and I arrived early to set up my laptop and a small projector in the dining room while Elizabeth finished cooking. "Are you sure we have to do this today?" Thomas asked, his voice strained. "It's Mom's birthday next week. This will devastate her. The business can't take any more losses," I said gently. "And would you rather she find out from us or from the police?" He nodded reluctantly, helping me connect the projector to the hidden outlet behind the china cabinet. Richard arrived from his golf game in high spirits, clapping Thomas on the shoulder and giving me his usual perfunctory cheek kiss. "Something smells delicious, Elizabeth," he called to his wife in the kitchen. "Special pot roast for my special man," she called back. If I hadn't known better, they would have seemed like the perfect, loving couple approaching their golden years with grace. Dinner proceeded normally at first. Elizabeth served, Richard dominated the conversation with stories about his golf game, and Thomas pushed food around his plate, barely eating. I remained uncharacteristically quiet, which Richard seemed to enjoy, taking my silence as submission. "Cassandra's business is really coming along now that we've implemented proper financial controls," Richard announced, cutting into his pot roast. "The quarterly numbers are looking quite promising." That was my cue. "Actually, Richard, I'd like to discuss those numbers." Something in my tone made him pause, fork halfway to his mouth. "Oh?" "I've been reviewing the accounts very carefully," I said, maintaining eye contact. "And I found some concerning discrepancies." Richard set down his fork, his expression carefully neutral. "All accounting systems have discrepancies during transition periods. That's normal. These aren't transition discrepancies," I continued, pulling out my tablet. "These are systematic diversions of funds to fake vendors." Elizabeth looked confused. "Richard, what is she talking about?" "Nothing, dear," Richard said dismissively. "Cassandra doesn't understand modern accounting practices. I've tried to explain." "Let me show you what I don't understand," I interrupted, pressing a button on my tablet that activated the projector. On the dining room wall appeared a spreadsheet tracking every fraudulent transaction over the past 3 months. Names, dates, amounts, account numbers, all highlighted in damning red. "What is this?" Elizabeth asked, squinting at the projection. "This is proof that Richard has stolen $83,000 from my business," I said calmly. The room went deadly silent. Elizabeth's hand flew to her mouth. Thomas stared at his father, waiting for a denial that didn't come. "Richard," Elizabeth whispered, "tell them this is a mistake." Richard's face had gone white, then red, his jaw working soundlessly for a moment before he found his voice. "This is preposterous. I've been helping this ungrateful girl modernize her amateurish bookkeeping. And this is the thanks I get? Accusations?" "These aren't accusations," I replied, swiping to the next screen. "This is evidence." The next slide showed Richard at my office computer, time-stamped footage clearly showing him transferring funds to one of the fake vendor accounts. "You've been recording me?" Richard sputtered, outrage replacing shock. "That's illegal. I'll sue you for invasion of privacy." "Security cameras in a place of business are perfectly legal in this state," I countered. "As my signed financial advisor, you have no expectation of privacy while working on business computers." "Richard," Thomas finally spoke, his voice breaking. "Just tell us it isn't true." Richard looked at his son, saw the desperate hope there, and something in him seemed to calculate the odds. For a moment, I thought he might continue denying everything. Instead, his strategy changed completely. "You don't understand the pressure," he said, his voice suddenly weary, defeated. "The expectations everyone has. The lifestyle we needed to maintain," Elizabeth gasped. "What are you saying?" "I made some bad investments," Richard continued, now playing the role of repentant sinner. "The market crashed. I needed to cover the losses temporarily. I was going to pay it all back before anyone noticed." "Bad investments?" I echoed. "Or bad bets?" Richard's head snapped up, eyes narrowing. "What are you implying?" I swiped to another screen showing his players' card records from 3 different casinos. Years of losses totaling over $400,000. Elizabeth began to sob. "Our retirement fund?" "I was on a streak of bad luck," Richard said desperately. "But I've developed a system now. I'm about to turn it all around." The money I borrowed from Cassandra was just seed money for a guaranteed return. Borrowed? I repeated incredulously. You stole from me. You created fake companies. You forged documents. That's not borrowing, it's fraud. I was helping you, Richard suddenly shouted, slamming his fist on the table, making the dishes jump. Your pathetic little decoration business was a joke before I stepped in. I created professional systems. I brought financial discipline. Without me, you'd still be playing with fabric swatches on your apartment floor. The mask had finally slipped, revealing the contempt he'd always felt. My pathetic little business paid for our house, I said quietly. It funds our life. It was successful before you touched it, and it will be successful again once I clean up your mess. You ungrateful bitch, Richard hissed. Dad. Thomas stood suddenly, his chair scraping back. That's enough. Sit down, Thomas, Richard snapped. This doesn't concern you. Doesn't concern me. Thomas's voice rose. You stole from my wife. You gambled away your retirement with Mom. You lied to all of us for years. How does that not concern me? Richard stood, towering over the table. I have given you everything. This house, your education, the connections that got you, your teaching position. You'd be nothing without me. I'd rather be nothing than be like you, Thomas said quietly. Something dangerous flashed in Richard's eyes. He looked around wildly, like a cornered animal, then lunged for my tablet. Give me that! I'm deleting this garbage. Thomas moved quickly, blocking his father. Don't touch her or her property. Richard, in his desperation, shoved Thomas hard. My husband stumbled backward, catching himself against the wall. Richard! Elizabeth screamed, finally finding her voice. Stop this immediately! But Richard was beyond reason now. He turned to me, face contorted with rage. You turned my son against me. You turned my wife against me. I'll destroy you and your precious business. He made another grab for my tablet, but I was ready, pulling it away and stepping back. It's too late, Richard. I've already secured the evidence in multiple locations. I've spoken to authorities. This ends now. Something in my tone finally penetrated his rage. Richard stopped, looking from me to Thomas to Elizabeth, seeing the united front against him. Fine, he said, suddenly calm again, straightening his golf shirt. What do you want? Money? I can get your money back. All of it? I asked. Including what you lost at the Golden Nugget Casino last weekend? His face fell. I need time. There is no more time, I said firmly. I've already contacted the police. They're waiting for my call to move forward with charges. You'd send your children's grandfather to prison? He asked, turning to Thomas. Son, are you going to let her do this to our family? Thomas looked at his father, the man he'd spent his life trying to please, and I saw something shift in his eyes' recognition of the manipulation that had always been there. You did this to our family, Thomas said quietly. Not Cassandra. Richard's shoulders sagged. For the first time, he looked his age, an old man whose carefully constructed facade had finally crumbled. I'll pay it back, he whispered. Somehow. Yes, I agreed. You will. What none of us expected was what happened next. Richard clutched suddenly at his chest, his face contorting in pain, and collapsed to the dining room floor. The ambulance arrived within minutes, but those minutes stretched like hours as Thomas performed CPR on his father while I called 911, and Elizabeth wept hysterically in the corner. The paramedics worked efficiently, stabilizing Richard enough to transport him to the hospital. Heart attack, one of them told us grimly as they loaded him into the ambulance. Significant one. You coming with him? Thomas looked at me, torn between family obligation and the betrayal still raw between us. I nodded. Go. I'll bring your mother. The emergency room was chaotic, a symphony of beeping machines and urgent voices. Elizabeth sat rigid in a plastic chair, staring blankly at the wall while we waited for news. She hadn't spoken since we'd arrived, shock rendering her mute. Mrs. Wilson? A tired-looking doctor emerged from behind sliding doors. Your husband is stable. The heart attack was serious, but we've placed a stent and he's responding well to treatment. Can we see him? Thomas asked, briefly. He needs rest. Richard looked small against the white hospital sheets, tubes and wires connecting him to various machines. His eyes fluttered open as we entered, focusing first on Elizabeth, then Thomas, and finally me. Something like shame flickered across his face before he closed his eyes again. Richard Wilson, having a convenient medical emergency when confronted with his crimes, came a hard voice from the doorway. Why am I not surprised? We turned to see a tall woman in a crisp pantsuit, her badge identifying her as Detective Sarah Reynolds. How did you? I began. Your forensic accountant friend called us, Detective Reynolds said. She was concerned when you didn't check in after the confrontation. She glanced at Richard's monitors. Stable? Is he? Good. Mr. Wilson, I'm placing you under arrest for embezzlement and fraud. You have the right to remain silent. You can't arrest him now. Elizabeth found her voice, shrill with panic. He's just had a heart attack. I'm not dragging him out of bed, ma'am, the detective said calmly. But he is under arrest. There will be an officer outside his door, and when he's medically cleared, he'll be processed. This is a family matter, Elizabeth insisted. We can handle it ourselves. Embezzlement isn't a family matter, Detective Reynolds replied. It's a criminal one. After she left, Elizabeth turned on me. Years of placid submission, giving way to maternal fury. Are you satisfied? My husband is lying here, fighting for his life, and you've set the police on him. Mom, Thomas said gently. Dad stole thousands of dollars. He committed fraud. I made a mistake, Elizabeth cried. Everyone makes mistakes. This wasn't a mistake, I said quietly. It was a calculated scheme that went on for months. Elizabeth's face hardened. You always thought you were too good for this family. Always looking down on our traditions, our values. Mom, that's not fair, Thomas began. But Elizabeth wasn't finished. If you go through with this, pressing charges against a sick old man, you are no longer welcome in my home, she declared. Either of you. The ultimatum hung in the air between us. Thomas looked stricken, torn between his wife and his mother. I understand you're upset, I said carefully. But Richard's actions have put my business, our livelihood, at risk. I can't just ignore that. Then you've made your choice, Elizabeth said, turning away from us. Please leave. In the hospital parking lot, Thomas leaned against our car, his body shaking with silent sobs. I held him, letting him release the grief and betrayal. What are we going to do? He asked finally, wiping his eyes. I don't know, I admitted. But we'll figure it out together. The following weeks were chaos. News of Richard's arrest spread through the business community like wildfire. Former colleagues distanced themselves. Country club memberships were quietly revoked, and the Wilson family name became associated with scandal rather than success. My business suffered collateral damage. Clients called to verify I was still solvent. Vendors demanded upfront payments. A major contract was pulled with vague references to instability in management. Thomas received concerned looks from fellow teachers and awkward questions from students who'd heard rumors about his criminal father. He came home one day to find his car vandalized with the word thief scratched into the paint. Elizabeth refused all contact, returning Thomas's calls with terse text messages stating she was supporting Richard through this witch hunt. She'd mortgaged the family home to pay for his defense attorney, Maxwell Cunningham, a shark-like man who specialized in white-collar crime. Mrs. Mitchell, Cunningham said smoothly during our first encounter at the preliminary hearing, my client is prepared to offer full restitution in exchange for dropping all charges. This can all go away quietly. It's not that simple, I replied. The money's gone, gambled away. How exactly does he plan to pay restitution? Mrs. Wilson is liquidating certain assets, Cunningham said vaguely. She's selling their home, I translated. The home they've lived in for 40 years. These are difficult circumstances, he acknowledged, without a hint of genuine empathy. But consider the alternative. A lengthy public trial. Your financial records scrutinized. Your business practices examined. Win or lose, your reputation will suffer. It was a threat, thinly veiled but effective. I'd already lost clients. A prolonged legal battle could sink Mitchell Interiors completely. I'll consider it, I said, not committing either way. Thomas was conflicted. Maybe we should take the deal, he suggested that night. If Mom's selling the house anyway, at least the money would go to saving your business instead of legal fees. And your father faces no consequences, I pointed out. He gets a clean slate to do this to someone else. He's had a heart attack, Cass. He's lost his reputation, his home. Isn't that consequence enough? I understood Thomas's position. Despite everything, Richard was still his father. But I also knew that men like Richard counted on forgiveness, on second chances they hadn't earned. Let me talk to the DA, I said finally. See what options we have. But before I could, another bomb dropped. A reporter from the local business journal called asking for comment on the Wilson family's pattern of financial misconduct. Pattern? He echoed, his stomach sinking. We found at least 3 other businesses with similar complaints against Richard Wilson in the past decade, the reporter explained. All settled quietly, but our sources indicate embezzlement was involved in each case. This wasn't Richard's first time, it was simply the first time he'd been caught publicly. The revelation hardened my resolve. I called the DA directly. I want to proceed with charges, I told her firmly, but I need to protect my business in the process. The DA understood. We can request limited disclosure of financial details. And given the evidence, we expect a plea rather than a full trial. I agreed, and we moved forward. When Richard learned additional victims had come forward, his bravado crumbled. He accepted a plea deal, guilty to reduced charges, restitution from his assets, and 18 months in a minimum security facility. Elizabeth filed for divorce the day after he signed the plea agreement. 43 years of marriage ended in a single signature. She called Thomas for the first time in weeks. I didn't know, she said, her voice hollow, about the gambling, about the other businesses. I believed in him completely. I know, Mom, Thomas said gently. We all did. I've lost everything, she continued. The house is sold. My friends won't speak to me. My husband is going to prison. Not everything, Thomas corrected. You still have us. There was a long pause. Do I? After what I said? Family helps family, Thomas said, echoing his father's words but giving them new, genuine meaning. We'll figure this out together. A week later, Elizabeth moved into our guest room, bringing only 2 suitcases of personal belongings. The rest had been sold to pay Richard's legal fees and partial restitution. At 68, she was starting over from scratch. The night before Richard reported to prison, he called our home. I answered, not recognizing the number. Cassandra. His voice was subdued, nothing like the confident man who'd invaded my business. Is Thomas there? One moment, I said, covering the receiver. It's your father. Do you want to speak to him? Thomas hesitated, then nodded, taking the phone. Their conversation was brief, mostly one-sided as Thomas listened. He wanted to apologize, Thomas said after hanging up, to both of us, but especially to you. He was too ashamed to say it directly. Do you believe him? I asked. I don't know, Thomas admitted. I want to, but I don't know if I can trust anything he says anymore. As we prepared for bed that night, Thomas wrapped his arms around me from behind. Thank you, he whispered. For what? For not saying I told you so. For giving my mother a place to stay. For being stronger than all of us. I turned in his embrace. We're strong together. That's what got us through this. The road ahead would be difficult. My business was wounded but not destroyed. Thomas was processing complex grief over the father he thought he knew. Elizabeth was rebuilding her identity after decades as Mrs. Richard Wilson. But for the first time, we were facing these challenges honestly, without Richard's toxic influence casting shadows over our decisions. Sometimes it takes losing what you thought you had to find what you truly need. Richard had been in Mountain View Correctional Facility for just over 3 weeks when the first anonymous review appeared on my business's Google page. Mitchell Interiors defrauded our community center project, took deposit money, and delivered substandard materials. Owner is currently under investigation. 1 star. By the end of the day, there were 5 similar reviews, each mentioning fraud, investigations, or questionable business practices. My phone rang constantly with concerned client. This has to be Richard, I told Thomas that evening, showing him the reviews. The timing is too coincidental. But how? Thomas asked, scrolling through the defamatory comments. He doesn't have internet access in prison. He doesn't need it, I realized. He has visitors. Richard's heart attack had garnered sympathy from his former colleagues and golf buddies. Several had visited him already, carrying messages to the outside world. I hired a reputation management firm immediately, but the damage was spreading. Someone had joined local community Facebook groups and was sharing warnings about Mitchell Interiors. An anonymous tip to the Better Business Bureau triggered an inquiry. A whisper campaign was threatening to unravel years of hard work. "He's trying to destroy me," I told Melissa over coffee. "From behind bars." "Classic narcissistic response," she replied. "If he can't have control, he'll burn everything down." 2 days later, I lost the Henderson account, a $200,000 commercial project that would have kept us comfortably in the black for months. The client was apologetic but firm. "We can't risk the association right now," he explained. "Maybe once things settle down." Thomas decided to visit his father, against my initial objections. "I need to confront him directly," he insisted. "Make him stop this vendetta." He returned from the prison ashen-faced. "He denied everything," Thomas reported. "Then said even if he was behind it, I should be supporting him, not you. That blood is thicker than water." "What did you say?" "That the full phrase is, the blood of the covenant is thicker than the water of the womb. It means chosen bonds are stronger than family ties." Thomas ran a hand through his hair. "Then he said you'd poisoned me against him, and that I'd regret choosing you when his contingency plans activated." "Contingency plans?" A chill ran down my spine. "What does that mean?" "I don't know." He wouldn't elaborate. We didn't have to wait long to find out. The next morning, Elizabeth received a call from an old family friend, Charlotte Weber. "Elizabeth, dear, I'm so sorry about that awful video," Charlotte said. "If there's anything we can do." "What video?" Elizabeth asked, confused. Charlotte went quiet. "Oh, you haven't seen it? Oh dear. Perhaps I shouldn't have mentioned it." After some coaxing, Charlotte sent the link. It was a crudely edited video using snippets from my business promotional materials, spliced with photos of Richard in handcuffs, overlaid with text claiming I had seduced Thomas to infiltrate the Wilson family and steal their wealth. "This is insane," Thomas whispered as we watched. "Who would believe this?" "People believe what they want to believe," Elizabeth said grimly. "Especially people who already thought Richard could do no wrong." The video had been sent to Richard's entire contact list, hundreds of business associates, country club members, and family friends, people who controlled contracts, sat on boards, and influenced business decisions throughout the city. "Mom, did Dad ever mention contingency plans to you?" Thomas asked. Elizabeth paled. "He kept a locked file box in his office, called it his insurance policy. I never knew what was in it." We drove to the storage unit where Elizabeth had moved Richard's remaining possessions after selling the house. The file box was there, but locked, with no key in sight. "Stand back," Thomas said, then broke the lock with a screwdriver. Inside were dozens of folders, each meticulously labeled with a person's or company's name, including mine. My folder contained detailed notes on my business practices, client relationships, vendor contracts, information Richard had gathered while helping me. But more disturbingly, it contained manufactured evidence of wrongdoing, photoshopped emails, doctored financial statements, fake text messages. He created a smear file on me before he even started stealing, I realized, feeling sick. This was never about helping. It was about controlling, and when that failed, destroying. Other folders contained similar dirt on business associates, fellow country club members, even church friends. Richard had spent years collecting leverage on everyone in his orbit. "My God," Elizabeth whispered, looking through folder after folder. "I was married to this man for 43 years. How did I not know?" We brought the entire box to Detective Reynolds, who whistled low as she examined the contents. "This is extensive," she said. "And frankly, disturbing. We'll need to add witness tampering and attempted extortion to Mr. Wilson's charges." While the legal system processed this new evidence, I focused on damage control. I hired a digital forensic expert to prove the defamatory video had originated from an IP address connected to Richard's former assistant, who had visited him in prison the day before it was released. I also reached out personally to every client, vendor, and business partner, explaining the situation transparently. Most were supportive, though some relationships were irreparably damaged by Richard's campaign. Thomas took emergency leave from his teaching position after students began asking him about the gold digger he'd married. The school administration was sympathetic but concerned about disruption. Elizabeth, surprisingly, became my strongest ally. She contacted every person in Richard's social circle, systematically dismantling his lies with the moral authority of a wronged wife. Richard has a gambling addiction and embezzled funds, she would say flatly. I've lost my home paying for his crimes. Cassandra is a victim, not a perpetrator. I know this because I live with her and my son now, since Richard's actions left me homeless. Her blunt honesty was more effective than any PR campaign. The final blow to Richard's revenge attempts came from an unexpected source. Martin Greaves, a fellow inmate serving time for financial crimes, approached Richard's attorney with information. Wilson bragged about his contingency plans to the wrong person, Cunningham told us during a meeting. Greaves recorded him on a contraband cell phone, admitting to orchestrating the defamation campaign and planning worse if it didn't work. Worse? I echoed. What does that mean? Cunningham looked uncomfortable. Apparently, he had arranged for someone to break into your home and business. Not to steal anything, just to, in his words, send a message. The recording was turned over to prosecutors, adding witness intimidation and conspiracy charges to Richard's case. His parole eligibility was revoked, extending his sentence by years. When Thomas visited his father again, Richard was a broken man. His revenge plans exposed, his leverage neutralized, his sentence extended, he had nothing left. Why? Thomas asked simply. Why couldn't you just admit what you did and make amends? Richard stared at the table between them. I've spent my whole life being Richard Wilson, financial genius, respected, admired. I couldn't be Richard Wilson, gambling addict and thief. So you decided to destroy Cassandra instead? I decided to protect what was left of my reputation, Richard corrected. She exposed me, made me lose everything. You lost everything because you stole from her, Thomas replied. You're still not taking responsibility. Richard finally looked up, meeting his son's eyes. I don't know how, he admitted. I've never had to before. It was as close to a moment of honesty as they'd ever shared. Small, inadequate, but real. The damage from Richard's revenge attempts lingered, like smoke difficult to grasp, but pervasive. My business survived, but was wounded. Thomas's career weathered the storm, but colleagues treated him differently. Elizabeth found herself navigating a social landscape where she was simultaneously pitied and ostracized. But Richard's final revenge plot had an unintended consequence. It united the three of us in ways his earlier manipulation never could. Facing a common enemy, we formed a family unit stronger than the one Richard had dominated for decades. As Elizabeth told her bridge club when she finally returned to social activities, I lost a husband but gained a daughter and rediscovered my son. Some trades are worth making. The courtroom was smaller than I'd imagined. Nothing like the dramatic, spacious chambers shown on television. Richard sat at the defense table in an ill-fitting suit that hung loosely on his frame. 6 months in prison, having melted away his golf course physique. He didn't turn when we entered, though his attorney, Maxwell Cunningham, glanced our way with a practiced, neutral expression. All rise, called the bailiff, and Judge Sandra Kapoor entered, a diminutive woman whose reputation for toughness in white-collar cases preceded her. We were there for a hearing on the additional charges stemming from Richard's revenge attempts. The original embezzlement case had been settled through his plea deal, but the witness intimidation and conspiracy charges were being treated as separate crimes committed while incarcerated. Your Honor, Cunningham began, these new allegations are merely the result of jailhouse gossip and misunderstandings. My client has already paid a significant price for his original offense. District Attorney Vanessa Chen, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s, stood. Your Honor, the evidence is far more substantial than jailhouse gossip. We have audio recordings of the defendant explicitly planning intimidation tactics against the victims. We have the testimony of his accomplices, who have accepted plea deals in exchange for their cooperation. And we have the actual results of his actions documented harassment, defamation, and business sabotage. Judge Kapoor reviewed the documents before her. Mr. Cunningham, this evidence appears quite compelling. Your client was recorded saying, and I quote, "If the business fails, she'll have nothing to show for sending me here. Make it happen." How do you explain this? Cunningham shifted strategies smoothly. My client was under extreme duress, Your Honor. A heart condition, adjustment to incarceration, medication, side effects. He wasn't thinking clearly. Interesting, Judge Kapoor said dryly, because his cardiologist's report indicates his condition was stabilized, and his prison medical records show no significant side effects from his medications. For the first time, Richard seemed to deflate, the reality of his situation sinking in. The hearing proceeded with technical legal arguments, but the outcome was clear. Richard would face trial for the additional charges, with the mountain of evidence making acquittal unlikely. Outside the courthouse, Cunningham approached me while Thomas helped Elizabeth to the car. "My client is prepared to accept responsibility for these additional charges," he said quietly, "in exchange for your testimony recommending leniency." "After everything he's done?" I asked incredulously. "He tried to destroy my business, my reputation, my marriage, and he'll likely serve an additional 3 to 5 years, Cunningham interjected. "But with your testimony about his age, health concerns, and family circumstances, it could be reduced to 18 months. He's 69, Mrs. Mitchell. Do you want him to die in prison?" The question hit harder than I expected. Despite everything, I didn't want that. "I'll consider it," I said finally. "But I need something in return." "Mrs. Mitchell, you're hardly in a position to make demands a full confession," I continued. "Not just to the court, but to his family. Everything, the gambling, the previous victims, the revenge plots. Complete honesty for the first time in his life." Cunningham studied me. "That's your condition? Not additional restitution?" "There's no money left," I said simply. "The only thing of value Richard still possesses is the truth. That's my price." 2 weeks later, we sat in a small conference room at the detention center. Richard, Thomas, Elizabeth, myself, and Cunningham. No prosecutors, no recordings, just family and the truth. For 4 hours, Richard spoke. The gambling addiction that began 20 years earlier with a lucky streak at a casino in Las Vegas. The growing debts. The first small borrowing from a client that he'd actually repaid. Then larger thefts as his addiction worsened. How he targeted my business not just for money but because my success threatened his self-image. How he'd planned revenge from the moment of his arrest, unable to accept accountability. "I was supposed to be the financial genius," he said, looking older than his years. "The family provider. The success story. When Cassandra built something substantial on her own, something I couldn't take credit for or control, it was unbearable." "Why?" Thomas asked, the simple question hanging in the air. Richard stared at his hands. "Because it meant I wasn't special anymore. Just an old man with nothing to offer except outdated advice no one wanted." The raw honesty silenced us all. For perhaps the first time, Richard was seeing himself clearly. Elizabeth wiped tears. "You were always more than your financial advice, Richard. I loved you for you. But you could never believe that was enough." The confession changed nothing legally. Richard still pled guilty to the additional charges. But Judge Kapoor did take my testimony into consideration at sentencing. While the defendant's actions were calculated, persistent, and caused significant harm, she stated, "I also recognize the value of the complete acceptance of responsibility he has now demonstrated. Therefore, I am sentencing him to an additional 24 months incarceration, to be served in a facility with appropriate medical care for his condition." As Richard was led away, he looked back at us one last time. No dramatic final words, no tearful apologies, just a small nod of acknowledgement before he disappeared through the secure door. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited. "Mrs. Mitchell, how do you feel about the sentence?" "Justice was served," I said simply. "Now we focus on healing and rebuilding." "Any comment on the financial impact to your business?" Thomas stepped forward. "My wife's business has weathered this storm and emerged stronger, with new security systems and financial controls that make it more resilient than ever. Mitchell Interiors continues to thrive despite my father's actions. His public support, unflinching and clear, was worth more than any legal victory. The aftermath of the legal battle left scars on all of us." Thomas struggled with guilt despite having done nothing wrong. Elizabeth navigated her new identity as a divorced woman after a lifetime as Mrs. Wilson. I fought to rebuild client trust while implementing extensive new financial safeguards. But we also found unexpected strength. Thomas became more assertive, no longer seeking approval from a father whose judgment had proven catastrophically flawed. Elizabeth discovered independence, taking a part-time position at a local library and building her own social circle. And I learned that vulnerability wasn't weakness. Sharing the truth about what had happened actually strengthened client relationships rather than damaging them. 6 months after the final sentencing, I received a letter from Richard. Unlike his previous communications, this one contained no manipulations, no blame shifting, no subtle undermining, just a simple acknowledgement. You were right to track every penny. I was wrong about everything else. It wasn't forgiveness, and it wasn't redemption. But it was, perhaps, a first step toward whatever relationship might be possible in the future, one based on truth rather than illusions. The first session of marriage counseling was awkward. Both Thomas and I sitting stiffly on opposite ends of Dr. Powell's comfortable sofa, unsure how to begin. "Why don't we start with why you're here?" Dr. Powell suggested, her calm demeanor creating a space for honesty. "My father stole from my wife's business, then tried to destroy her reputation when he was caught," Thomas said flatly. "I didn't stop it before it happened. I didn't believe her when she first suspected him. Now we're trying to figure out if our marriage can survive that kind of betrayal on multiple levels." I reached for Thomas's hand across the sofa cushions. "I don't blame Thomas for his father's actions, but," Dr. Powell prompted gently. "But there was a moment when he didn't choose me," I admitted. "When he questioned my evidence, defended his father. And I don't know how to forget that moment." Over weeks of sessions, we excavated the fault lines Richard had exploited Thomas's deep-seated need for paternal approval. My fierce independence born from building something from nothing, our different approaches to family loyalty. "Richard didn't create these differences between you," Dr. Powell noted in our 6th session. "He merely weaponized them. The question is whether you can transform these differences from vulnerabilities into strengths." Slowly, painfully, we rebuilt trust. Thomas joined me at business meetings, visibly supporting my decisions when clients expressed concerns about stability. I accompanied him to school functions where colleagues had previously whispered about the Wilson scandal, standing proudly at his side. At home, we implemented new patterns. Weekly financial reviews together, ensuring complete transparency. Regular check-ins about family boundaries, especially as Elizabeth adjusted to living with us. Intentional conversations about our future, untangling it from the shadow Richard had cast. The business required different rebuilding strategies. I hired Julia Morales, a respected CFO with forensic accounting background, to overhaul our financial systems. Richard exploited single-point verification. Julia explained as she implemented new protocols. No one person should have unilateral control over funds, no matter how trusted. We created triple authentication requirements for all transactions over $1,000, separated accounting duties so no individual could both authorize and execute payments, implemented surprise audits and regular financial reviews with the entire team. "Isn't this overkill?" my office manager asked during training. "Lightning doesn't strike twice. It's not about fear," I explained. "It's about building a business strong enough to weather any storm. These systems protect everyone, including our clients." The costs were substantial, both the direct losses from Richard's embezzlement and the indirect costs of rebuilding. Legal fees, PR consultants, the reputation management firm, Julia's salary, new software systems, lost contracts during the crisis. All told, nearly $300,000 in damages and recovery expenses. Insurance covered some losses, but not all. I took out a small business loan to bridge the gap. The irony of going into debt because of Richard's financial crimes not lost on me. Thomas found me at the kitchen table late one night, surrounded by spreadsheets. "We'll get through this," he said, massaging my tense shoulders. "I know," I sighed. "But it's like climbing a mountain after someone cuts your safety rope." "Then we climb twice as carefully," he replied, "and check each other's knots." Elizabeth's presence in our home added another dimension to rebuilding. Initially intended as temporary, her stay extended as she rediscovered herself after decades in Richard's shadow. She enrolled in community college art classes, something Richard had dismissed as impractical. She made new friends unconnected to their previous social circle. She even began dating, shyly telling us about coffee with a widowed professor emeritus from the local university. "I keep waiting to feel guilty," she confessed one evening as we shared a bottle of wine. "Like, I'm betraying Richard, but then I remember how completely he betrayed us, and the guilt evaporates." "You're allowed happiness, Mom," Thomas told her. "Dad forfeited any claim on your loyalty." The most surprising development in our rebuilding process came from an unexpected quarter. Catherine Bowman, the owner of a competing interior design firm, called me out of the blue. "I heard about what happened with your father-in-law," she said without preamble. "The same thing happened to my brother's construction company 3 years ago. Different perpetrator, same playbook. I'd like to meet." Catherine introduced me to several other small business owners who'd experienced similar betrayals, family members, trusted employees, or advisors who'd exploited their positions. Together, we formed a support and advocacy group, sharing recovery strategies and warning signs. "Financial predators count on silence," Catherine explained at our first formal meeting. "Victims feel ashamed, stupid for trusting the wrong person. By sharing our experiences, we remove that weapon from their arsenal." The group expanded quickly, attracting businesses across industries. We developed educational materials, created a confidential reporting system for suspected embezzlement, and established relationships with law enforcement agencies specializing in financial crimes. 9 months after Richard's final sentencing, I was invited to speak at a regional business conference on financial security for small enterprises. Standing at the podium, looking out at hundreds of entrepreneurs like myself, I felt a sense of purpose emerging from the pain. "Trust is the foundation of business," I began, "but verification is its cornerstone. I learned this lesson the hard way, through betrayal by someone I should have been able to trust implicitly. Today, I'm sharing that lesson so you don't have to learn it the same way." As I detailed the warning signs I'd missed, the systems I'd implemented since, and the community we'd built among survivors, I watched understanding dawn across faces in the audience. This wasn't just about my story anymore, it was about transforming individual trauma into collective wisdom. After the presentation, a young woman approached me, her expression serious. "My uncle is helping with my startup's finances," she said quietly. "Last week, I noticed some discrepancies. After hearing you speak, I'm going to install monitoring software tonight. Trust your instincts," I told her, squeezing her hand. "And call me if you need backup." That night, I told Thomas about the encounter. If Richard's actions prevent even one other business owner from experiencing what we did, perhaps some meaning comes from the mess. "You've always found ways to build something beautiful from whatever materials life gives you," Thomas said, "even when those materials include betrayal and pain." Rebuilding wasn't a linear process. Some days brought progress, a new client signing on despite the controversy, Thomas standing up to a family friend who made excuses for Richard, Elizabeth laughing freely for the first time in months. Other days brought setbacks, a bank questioning our loan application due to recent financial irregularities, Thomas receiving a manipulative letter from Richard, my own 3 a.m. panic attacks about cash flow. But gradually, the good days outnumbered the bad. The business stabilized, then began to grow again. Our marriage found new depth through hard-won honesty. Elizabeth blossomed in her independence. 1 year after Richard's embezzlement came to light, we gathered in our backyard. Thomas, Elizabeth, myself, and close friends who'd stood by us throughout the ordeal. No formal occasion, just an acknowledgement that we'd survived the worst year of our lives and emerged changed but intact. As twilight settled around us and conversation flowed easily, I slipped inside to check my phone. Force of habit, I still monitored business notifications constantly, a lingering effect of financial trauma. A new email appeared from an unfamiliar address. The subject line read simply, "Thank you." It was from Martin Greaves, the inmate who'd recorded Richard's revenge plotting. He'd been released and was building a new life. "Your father-in-law talks about you sometimes," he wrote. "Not with anger anymore, but with something that might be respect. He says you were smarter than him in the end. For what it's worth, he's right. Some of us in here are taking financial literacy classes now. Your story travels further than you know. I stood in my kitchen, surrounded by the sounds of loved ones laughing in my backyard, reading words from a stranger about a man who'd tried to destroy me, and felt the final piece click into place. Rebuilding wasn't just about restoring what was lost, it was about creating something entirely new from the experience. I returned to the gathering, sliding my arm around Thomas's waist as he chatted with friends. He looked down at me, a question in his eyes. "Everything okay?" "Better than okay," I replied. "Just grateful for what we've built together." In the darkness of our yard, with string lights twinkling above and voices of friends surrounding us, I felt something I hadn't experienced since before Richard entered my business piece, with the present and hope for the future. The hypervigilance that had served me well, tracking every penny, had evolved into something healthier. Awareness without anxiety, caution without fear. We had rebuilt, not just what Richard had damaged, but something stronger. Something he had never been able to create despite all his financial genius. A foundation of honesty, accountability, and genuine support. Some lessons cost too much, but once paid for, they're yours forever. 1 year to the day after Richard's arrest, I stood in my expanded office space, surrounded by the Mitchell Interiors team, raising a glass of champagne. To growth through adversity, I toasted, looking at the faces of people who had weathered the storm with me. In the 12 months since the embezzlement came to light, we'd not only recovered but thrived. The sophisticated financial systems Julia had implemented became a selling point, with high-end clients concerned about security. Our public handling of the crisis transparent, ethical, resilient, attracted companies with similar values. When clients ask about the incident, I tell them it's the best stress test a business could have survived, Julia said, sipping her champagne. If Mitchell Interiors can handle that level of betrayal and come out stronger, imagine how well we manage everyday challenges. This reframing had transformed our narrative from victims to victors. The business had expanded to 12 employees, with a portfolio now including commercial projects throughout the region. Thomas had found his own path to growth as well. After much soul-searching, he'd applied for an administrative position at his school dean of students, a role that utilized his natural empathy and newly discovered assertiveness. "I spent my whole life trying not to become my father," he told me one night as we prepared dinner together. "I thought that meant avoiding ambition, staying in my safe teaching position, never reaching too high, but I was still letting him define me, just in the negative." "And now?" I asked, passing him chopped vegetables for the stir-fry. "Now I'm making choices based on what I actually want, not in reaction to him." He smiled, a confidence in his expression that had been growing steadily. "It turns out I like having influence, making decisions. I just approach it completely differently than he did." Thomas's relationship with Richard remained complicated. After 3 months of no contact following the final sentencing, Thomas had begun writing to his father in prison. Not frequent letters, not emotional ones, but steady communication, establishing new boundaries. "I'm not abandoning him," Thomas explained when I asked about his motivation. "But I'm not protecting him from consequences anymore either. I'm trying to find a middle path accountability with compassion." Richard's responses evolved over time. The initial letters were manipulative, subtly blaming others or circumstances for his situation. But as months passed with Thomas maintaining firm boundaries, Richard's tone shifted. "He asked about the business today," Thomas said after reading a recent letter. Not with resentment or sarcasm. He actually asked if we'd recovered from the financial damage he caused. He used those words, "financial damage I caused." "That's progress," I acknowledged, surprised. "He's taking an addiction recovery program in prison," Thomas continued. "Gambling addiction? Financial manipulation? He's finally addressing it instead of denying it." I wasn't ready to forgive. Richard might never be completely, but I recognized the importance of this shift for Thomas and Elizabeth. Healing didn't require reconciliation, but it did require truth. Elizabeth's transformation was perhaps the most remarkable. The timid woman who had deferred to Richard for decades had blossomed in his absence. "I've spent my entire adult life asking, what would Richard want?" Before making any decision, she confided as we worked in the garden she'd planted in our backyard. "Even choosing a paint color or ordering at a restaurant, always anticipating his preferences, his judgments. She patted soil around a newly planted rose bush. Now I wake up each morning and ask myself, what do I want today? It's terrifying and exhilarating. Elizabeth had moved into her own apartment 3 months earlier, a small but sunny one-bedroom near the community college where she now took classes in art history and creative writing. She joined a widow and divorcee support group, made new friends, even begun volunteering at a women's shelter. The shelter director says my experience is valuable, Elizabeth told us over Sunday dinner, now hosted at her apartment. Women who've been financially controlled by partners, I understand that journey. I can help them navigate the practical steps toward independence. Her relationship with Professor Robert Miller, the widower she'd met at college, had deepened into genuine companionship. He joined us for dinner occasionally, a gentleman who listened to Elizabeth with attentive respect Richard had never shown. Robert asked if I'd accompany him to an academic conference in Boston next month, Elizabeth mentioned, a girlish blush coloring her cheeks. I've never been to Boston. You should go, Mom, Thomas encouraged. You've earned some adventure. The prison visit hadn't been my idea. In fact, I'd resisted Thomas's suggestion for weeks. I understand why you need contact with him, I said. He's your father. But he tried to destroy everything I've built. I don't see any benefit in facing him. I think there might be, Thomas replied carefully. Not for him, for you. Closure, maybe. Or just seeing that he no longer has power over us. After much consideration, I agreed to one visit, not out of forgiveness or reconciliation, but to reclaim the final piece of myself that Richard still occupied my fear of his influence. Mountain View Correctional Facility was neither as grim as I'd imagined, nor as comfortable as Richard probably expected. Institutional and sterile, but not inhumane. We sat at a metal table in the visiting area, surrounded by other inmates and their families. Richard looked older, thinner, the prison uniform hanging loosely on his frame. His once commanding presence diminished by institutional routine and the equalizing effect of incarceration. Cassandra, he acknowledged, his voice lacking the resonant authority I remembered. Thank you for coming. Thomas thought it was important, I replied neutrally. Richard nodded, accepting this limited explanation. How is the business? Thriving, I said simply. We implemented comprehensive security systems. A faint smile. Track every penny? And then some. We sat in silence for a moment, the ambient noise of the visiting room filling the space between us. I've had a lot of time to think, Richard finally said, about why I did what I did. It wasn't just about money. I know, I replied. It was about control. He looked up, surprised by my directness. You couldn't stand that I built something successful without your help, I continued. That Thomas respected my business acumen. That I didn't need your approval or permission. Richard's jaw worked for a moment before he responded. Yes, he admitted. That was difficult for me to accept. The simple acknowledgement, devoid of excuses or deflection, caught me off guard. The program counselor calls it toxic entitlement, Richard continued. The belief that my experience entitled me to control over others' choices, over their businesses, over their lives. It cost you everything, I observed. Yes. He met my eyes directly and caused considerable damage to you in the process. For what it's worth, I regret that now. Not an apology exactly, but perhaps as close as Richard Wilson could come to one. Your regret doesn't rebuild what you tried to tear down, I said. I did that. Thomas and Elizabeth did that. The people who stood by us did that. I know, he nodded. Thomas tells me you've grown the business. New security systems. Industry recognition. We turned your betrayal into a case study in resilience, I confirmed. Other businesses now consult with us on fraud prevention. Richard looked down at his hands once manicured, now institutional. Ironic. As the visit concluded, Richard asked one final question. Is Elizabeth truly all right? Thomas says she's different. She's herself for the first time in decades, I replied honestly. It suits her. Walking out of the prison into the bright sunshine, I felt lighter, as if I'd set down a heavy burden I hadn't realized I was carrying. Not forgiveness. Richard hadn't earned that, but liberation from the power he'd held over my thoughts, my fears, my business decisions. That evening, I gathered Thomas, Elizabeth, and Julia for dinner at our home. I want to launch a nonprofit, I announced. The financial safety network education, resources, and support for small business owners to protect themselves from fraud and embezzlement. Because of today's visit? Thomas asked. Partially, I acknowledged. But mostly because of everything we've learned this past year. This knowledge is too valuable to keep to ourselves. Within 6 months, the Financial Safety Network was operational, offering free seminars, confidential consultations, and a support group for fraud survivors. We partnered with local law enforcement, accounting programs at universities, and business associations to spread awareness of warning signs and prevention strategies. At our first major conference, I stood at the podium looking out at hundreds of business owners, some curious, some already victimized, all vulnerable without proper knowledge. Financial predators count on our silence, I began, on our shame at being deceived, on our isolation in the aftermath. Today, we break that silence together. The growth wasn't just professional. Thomas and I renewed our wedding vows on our 7th anniversary. The ceremony small but meaningful. Elizabeth stood beside me as matron of honor. Professor Robert Miller beside Thomas as best man. When I promised for better or worse 6 years ago, I had no idea how much worse it could get, Thomas said in his vows. But I also had no idea how much stronger we could become through that fire. I choose you again, Cassandra, with clearer eyes and a braver heart than before. As we celebrated afterward in our backyard, Elizabeth approached with a small gift box. I found this while sorting through some old family photos, she explained. Inside was a delicate silver penny on a chain. My grandmother gave this to my mother on her wedding day, Elizabeth continued. She said it symbolized prosperity and wisdom in handling resources. I thought it belonged with you now, the woman who truly understands the value of tracking every penny. I fastened it around my neck, touched by the symbolic passing of financial wisdom from one generation of women to another, a stark contrast to Richard's destructive financial legacy. Later that evening, checking my business monitoring system one last time before bed, old habits die hard, I caught Thomas watching me with a smile. Some might call that obsessive, he teased gently, echoing words I'd used to describe my tracking system long ago. I call it thorough, I replied, completing the familiar exchange. Besides, it saved our business once. It could again. I hope it never needs to, Thomas said, wrapping his arms around me from behind. But if it does, we're ready. Together, I leaned back against him, feeling secure in a way that went beyond financial safeguards or legal protections. The greatest security system we'd built wasn't in spreadsheets or authentication protocols. It was in the unwavering support we'd shown each other through the darkest days. Richard had tried to drive us apart, using family bonds as weapons. Instead, he'd inadvertently forged connections stronger than before, authentic relationships built on genuine respect rather than obligation or control. Sometimes, the people closest to us can cause the most damage, but with courage and determination, betrayal can lead to unexpected growth and strength. I wouldn't wish our experience on anyone, but I wouldn't trade the wisdom we'd gained either. Every penny counted, indeed. But the true value was in what couldn't be measured: integrity, resilience, and the courage to rebuild from betrayal. What would you do if someone close to you betrayed your trust? Would you track every penny like I did? Or do you have different ways to protect yourself? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life experiences and lessons learned the hard way. Share this with someone who might need a reminder that betrayal doesn't have to be the end of the story. Sometimes it's just the difficult beginning of something stronger. Thank you for listening. And remember, trust is valuable, but verification is priceless.